let's talk about Jimmy Carter's presidency. Some say it was very different, and as we just said, some consider him the greatest former president ever. Why is that?
So Jimmy Carter, he came into office, in the wake of Watergate. And so he was very much a breath of fresh air. He built a cross-racial coalition. He's, a white liberal reformer from the Deep South. And the fact he was a political outsider made him a good president for that year, for 1976. People were upset about Watergate. They wanted something new. They wanted a breath of fresh air. But when he was in office, things did not go his way. We had the Iran hostage crisis, which was blamed to some extent on him. We had enormous amounts of inflation. Even though he did everything he was supposed to do in response to those things, boy, the public just turned on him. It wasn't helped that he was not really much of a politician. He didn't want to make compromises. He was a very moral person. He wanted to do the right thing, and that's not always the best way to get things done in Washington. So his presidency wound up being considered at the time at least something of a failure, although it has been reevaluated pretty strongly since then.
Dan, let's talk about how safe it is to call Mr. Carter's work outside the presidency, really his shining moments. Take us through some of those.
So, while he's in office, his big success really comes from his peace negotiations between Israel and Egypt, which winds up winning him the Nobel Peace Prize. And it was lasting. I mean, it's more than 40 years now of peace between Israel and Egypt. But after leaving office, his biggest accomplishments are in the areas of humanitarian work. Peacemaking still, but also things like Habitat for Humanity. He and his wife would spend a week every year on Habitat for Humanity up and into their 90s. He also crusaded personally to try and get rid of this scourge, this parasitic organism in Africa called the guinea worm. When he started doing this in 1980, there were about 3.5 million cases per year. Now, this past year, there were about 7 cases of guinea worm. It's a horrible disease, and he was able to largely eradicate it. He was America's kind of ambassador for peace all over the globe, going to places, again, like Israel, Palestine, also the Middle East and Asia, and working for peace there. I mean, he is really, as I said, was considered America's greatest ex-president, even if he wasn't considered its greatest president.
Yeah, do you feel like that kind of makes everyone forget then? I mean, it really was a tough time for the country, like you mentioned.
Absolutely. So we talk now about inflation in the current era and how horrible inflation the last couple of years has been. But in the late 1970s, we had stagflation. So we not only had high levels of inflation, much higher than we saw in the last couple of years, 17, 18% inflation. But at the same time, we also had very, very high levels of unemployment. At the same time, we also saw gas prices, in some cases, quadrupling. Can you imagine how upset people would be about that? And Jimmy Carter really was blamed for all of this. And there wasn't a whole lot he could do. He did what he was supposed to do. He brought in Paul Volcker to the Federal Reserve to really raise interest rates and try and get the economy under control. But it just wasn't enough. Voters turned on him. He left office with an approval rating in the 30s.
All right, Dan, let's talk about the Iran hostage crisis. The day he leaves office, basically, they are freed. It's almost like they had it in for Jimmy Carter. It was really some bad luck with that.
Well, we don't actually think it was bad luck. There actually has been revelations in the past couple of years that the Republican Party had actually sent operatives to Iran to let them know that they shouldn't release the hostages before the election, as they thought that would help Jimmy Carter. We don't know if President Reagan actually knew that this was going on, but John Connally and others high up in the Republican Party were working to make a deal to try and make sure that Carter didn't get the approval bounce that would come from the hostages being released while he was in office.
But again, we talk about his life after the presidency. I can't believe it. It's actually been 43 years since he left office, and he leaves behind this amazing legacy of service, as you'd been speaking about. But he also kept a relatively low profile. He lived a small town Georgia life. Do you feel like we could ever see a modern former president live in that kind of manner?
Well, yeah, he was, I think, unique. I can't imagine a president leaving office now. When presidents leave office, they have the opportunity to make tens of millions of dollars a year just in speaking fees. And Carter just didn't do it. He said he didn't want to sell out. He just lived in this house. You can go on Zillow and see his house he lived and died in. It would cost about $250,000, $350,000. He lived an incredibly modest lifestyle, and he was comfortable with that. He didn't want to leave his hometown. But the upside of that for him was that throughout his life, he was just able to walk down the street in his hometown without anyone bothering him. He was able to go and teach Sunday school again in his hometown up into his 90s. It's hard to imagine any modern president wanting to live this way or being able to live in this way.
Yeah, it's amazing. They say that the Secret Service that was there to look after him had a house as big as his. Just remarkable. Dan, how do you think the legacy of Jimmy Carter will be remembered and laid out?
So when Jimmy Carter left office, he was considered almost as a dismal failure. People just did not think saw him as a failure in office. Since then, if you look at the rankings that political scientists and historians do every couple of years of presidency, you've seen him rising and rising and rising in the ranks. So he's not considered a great president, probably will never be considered a great president, but he's considered to be way ahead of his time. A lot of things he was talking about while he was in office are stuff we are still trying to do today. For instance, Jimmy Carter, and when he was in president, he was actually very, very close to legalizing marijuana. He was so close that Marlboro had actually already trademarked their brand of marijuana cigarettes, Marley's, and got sued by the Bob Marley estate. He was talking about universal health care. He was installing solar panels in the White House and gave speeches about how we had to get away from dependency on foreign oil and move over to renewable energy sources. And this is 45, 50 years ago. So he was, as basically as the country has moved more towards what Jimmy Carter was pushing for, he's been valued much more positively.
Yeah, and what a legacy he leaves behind. Dan Cassino, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us today, and have a happy new year.